Hello, everyone. This is Carol Dimitrov with OPA Community Outreach, and we are pleased to have Rick Levine with us today. Rick's title of his presentation is The X-Tiles, The Truth is Out There. X-tiles are non-Ptolemaic aspects reduced by some astrologers to minor aspects status. Perhaps you've heard of quintiles and septiles, but what do you do when you see one? How do you find them? And what do they mean? This class is a quick and easy guide to locating and interpreting the X-tiles in natal charts and by transit. Once you see them in action, you'll know why they cannot be ignored. And many of you know already a lot about Rick, but just for those of you that might be new to astrology or to learning about Rick has been a professional astrologer since 1976. He's lectured throughout the world extensively and is a founding trustee of Kepler College. He was the former president of the Washington State Astrology Association and is an ongoing and supportive member of OPA and a lot of other astrological organizations. Rick continues to support astrology while sharing his insights, knowledge, and poetry with the world. Rick writes the tarot.com horoscopes and has monthly events that have been recorded live at Soul Food Cafe House in Redmond, Washington, and they are available to view on his YouTube channel. Rick is known for his knowledge and ability to connect with his audience and host retreats and conferences around the world, and he'll be telling us a little bit about what he is up to as well. And to find out more about Rick, you can visit him at www.stariq.com. So Rick, it's all yours.
If I was really good, I would have had that music cued. I would have had a John Philip Sousa marching band. Well, greetings all. And before I jump into the material, which will be plentiful, I just would like to spend a quick moment and just tell you a couple of things that are coming up. Obviously, most of you already know that we're in the closing period of time of UAC preparation, and the United Astrology Conference in Chicago is Memorial Day weekend and the few days before and after, and that's going to be an extraordinary period of time. I will be there and doing a couple of lectures and sitting on a couple of panels, and it'll just be a fantastic few days. I do have, let's see if I can get this here. My screen is being shared. You can see this? Yes? No? Carol?
Yes, Rick, we can see that.
Okay, so I've been doing a couple of workshop retreats every year at Brighton Bush Hot Springs. It's a magical retreat conference center in Central Oregon, up in the old growth forest. There are amazing hot tubs, good food, no internet, no telephone service. It is off the grid. And this summer, my workshop will be bringing the planets down into our lives, and that's going to be on July 29th through August 2nd. You can go to brightonbush.com if you want more information there, or links from my webpage or Facebook page. The other thing that I have coming up is I have my 10th workshop that I've been doing with Heaven and Earth workshops. I've done workshops with them both on my own, and when Jeff Jower, my now deceased astrology buddy, brother, and partner, Jeff and I did workshops, and I have for Heaven and Earth workshops in Bali, Mexico, India, and the one that's coming up right now will be in Bali. There's and Heaven and Earth workshops is the website, and this will fill out because it's limited to 25 people. And so it will fill up, and Bali is just an amazing, the complete course curriculum is online, and it's just an absolutely amazing experience and place. And I invite anyone to check out the information there. And the title of that is Think Cosmically, Act Locally, Putting Astrology to Work in Our Lives. And in this and most of my individual retreat workshops, the curriculum actually becomes our individual charts. That's what we use for jumping off. As Carol mentioned, I do a monthly talk at Soul Food Books and Coffee House in Redmond, Washington. You can find that either through my Facebook page or Star IQ. And I write a daily column and blah, 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 blah. I think that's probably enough. I know I missed something that I was going to say. Yeah, and just while we're all here, the OPA retreat coming up, just because I won't be there, I wish I was. I'm going to be in Bali during that time. But if you've never been to an OPA retreat, they can change the way you look at and work with astrology. They're very, very powerful and different than UAC, because UAC is an 11th house global are very individualized and very transformative when it comes to individual work. So I think I've covered enough of that. I'm sure there were other things I was going to say, but let's get into the material. Yes. The X-tiles. So I actually need to give you, Carol, can you kill the camera, or is the camera my screen is being shared? I'm assuming that that's okay. I can't hear. All right. All right. I'm just assuming that the camera's still on. Okay, I think that did it. No.
I'll be doing it just a second, Rick. Let's see.
All right, I'm not being.
We have a couple
I'm not being impatient.
Yeah, let me just grab it. You're off now, Rick. Perfect.
Okay. All right, but my screen is good.
Your screen is perfect.
I like perfect. Well, you know what they say. Perfect is almost good enough for a Virgo. All right, so a quick short story about the X-tiles and where this came from. As I'm one of those people who came into astrology not knowing what was important other than what I read about. And one of the first books, one of my first astrology teachers through books was Dane Rudhyar. And Dane Rudhyar actually was one of those people who talked a lot about the cycles, and I originally learned of quintiles and septiles in his writing, not realizing that most astrologers didn't use them. And then my first really serious study book was a book called, I think it was called something like the Handbook for Humanistic Astrology. That might be almost 80% correct, by Michael Meyer. And in that book also, the non-traditional aspects were used. And so I began using quintiles and septiles early on in my work, which really means that since the mid 70s, I've been looking at quintiles and septiles. And as I think the write-up may have said, I would no sooner do a chart without quintiles than I would without Mars, or without a square, without squares. I mean, to me, we all limit what we look at and what techniques we use. And I understand that not every technique is for every astrologer. I meet good, intelligent, wise, practicing astrologers who use techniques every day that I don't use. And so we have to pick and choose. And they use, and I use techniques they don't use. I'm just saying that for me, although this is certainly not the central point of my work, the whole idea of using these what I would call non-traditional or non-Ptolemaic aspects is extremely important. Somewhere along the line at a conversation, probably one of those late night conversations in a smoke-filled room at a conference, we began talking about the various non-traditional aspects, and someone said something about well, talk to Rick, he uses those reptiles. And then it became reptiles and turnstiles and sextiles and quintiles and infantiles and kitchen tiles and all the tiles. And so, in a way, one of my points is that when we work with astrology, we limit our thinking by by the way we frame our, by the way we create our frame of reference. So my goal today is to, for those of you who already use quintiles and septiles, to maybe take it a step further. For those of you who say, nope, I've never used them, never heard of them, or I've heard of them, but my goal today is to open up your thinking a little bit and to make a case for why these may be a very important piece of the astrological body of knowledge that is only coming into wide use now. And I say wide use now, meaning over the past 50 years, and still just, just kind of eking its way into consciousness. So, all right, so I want to start off and just talk a little bit about aspects and kind of back up and get a general view of aspects in general. When I teach this work with the class in front of me, I will often ask the class, so how many people here use aspects in their regular chart work? And of course, most people raise their hands, and of course they go, duh. I mean, you look at a chart, you look at aspects. And they go, okay, everyone put your hand down. How many people use harmonics in their regular use, in their regular work of astrology? And usually in a group of 40 or 50 people, usually 2 or 3 or 5 hands go up and the others don't. And to that, I say, there's a problem here, because what that tells me is that people do not understand what harmonics are, because if you're using aspects, you are using harmonics, period. It's just a different way of languaging it. It's just simply a different way of talking about what we're doing. So here today, I want to kind of bridge the gap a little bit between aspects and harmonics. And although with harmonics we have tools to look at much higher frequency, at much at aspects that we wouldn't normally look at. But the fact of the matter is that aspects are divisions of a circle, and that we look at an opposition, which is 1/2 of a circle, and the fraction 1/2, that becomes 1/2. That's the 2. That's the second harmonic. A trine is 1/3 of a circle. That's the third harmonic. A square is 1/4, 1/4 of a circle. That's the fourth harmonic. So when we look at aspects, whether we know it or not, we're looking at harmonics. Understanding the relationship between aspects and harmonics, however, really can move our aspect work into a different level of understanding, and that's part of what we're looking at today. So I want to talk a little bit about orbs. And orbs are a very important consideration here, because most people, I often say that if you put 5 astrologers in a room, chances are there are 3 different house cusp systems that they're using and 5 different sets of orbs. Every astrologer has their own orbs. Just for definition, for some of you who may be newer to astrology, the orb is the degree differential between 2 planets that are in aspect. So that if 2 planets are exactly at the same degree and same minute, they are conjunct with a 0-degree orb. But if you have a planet at 5 degrees of Cancer and another planet at 7 degrees of Cancer, those are 2 degrees apart, so they are conjunct with a 2-degree orb. And so we use orbs as kind of these cutoff points between what's an aspect and what's not. And that's a bit of a dangerous thing to do. And it's even worse with computers, because when we calculate them by hand, at least we can kind of see what falls within the range and what doesn't. But when we use our computers to calculate aspects, if it doesn't meet the orb that we've required, we won't even know it's there. And so sometimes we miss really important things by narrowing our orbs too much. And I like to use the image of fishing with a net. And to all of you vegans out there, my apologies, but it's a metaphor that works. And that is when you use a net to fish, the size of the holes within the netting determine the size of the smallest fish that you'll catch. So if there's this amazing species of fish that is 1.5 inches wide and 2 inches long, and you're using a web, a net that is that has 2-inch holes in it, you'll never know that this species of fish exists. And it's my contention that most of us who have even looked at quintiles and septiles use orbs that are so arbitrarily narrow that we don't ever really understand how these aspects work. We'll come back to that in a moment. The third thing on this overview screen is the concept of what I call the quantum astrology perspective. This is something that is built into my work. Many of you who have been to my workshops know that there's some relationship between my astrology and the whole quantum physics metaphor. I would suggest that if you want more on this, I just did a talk in Kolkata, India, a couple of months ago that was on fate versus free will from the quantum astrology or from the quantum mechanics perspective. But with respect to aspects, the idea of quantum astrology is this. We are taught to look at planets as points. But just like in quantum physics, the universe is both particle and wave. Planets are both particles and waves. I mean, the Saturn is a point, you know, at 9 degrees of Capricorn, which is where it is now. It's a point, but it's also a 29.5 year wave. It's three waves or 3 cycles a century, roughly. When we look at aspects in charts, we're actually trained to look at points. This is the sun square Mars. This is this planet quincunx or whatever to that planet. We're looking at 2 planets and we're isolating that relationship between those 2 points. The fact is that charts have they hum. It's the real music of the spheres. And when you look at a chart and you see a predominance of one aspect or another, or a total lacking of one aspect or another, that tells you something very important about the chart. And so when I look at charts and I see a chart with lots of trines and no squares, or a chart with lots of septiles, or a chart with no septiles, this to me becomes as important, or maybe even sometimes more important than what particular planets are there. Now, I'm not saying that this is a double negative. I'm not saying that we shouldn't. My editor would say that in a positive way. It's important that we look at the individual aspects, but it's also important that we don't miss the fact that a chart with lots of quintiles develops its own quintile hum. And the question is, what is that hum, and how do we interpret that, and how do we work with that? So we will look at this whole idea of what I call the wave concept rather than the particle concept when we're looking at aspects. And that gets us to the fourth point on this screen, and that is the idea of the field of resonance, the hum, versus any one single aspect. All right, for some reason my screen isn't advancing the way I want it to. Oh, there we go. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, aspects are harmonics. They are one in the same. And that a conjunction is the first harmonic. You divide a circle by 1. An opposition, you divide a circle by 2. That's the second harmonic. A trine, you divide a circle by 3. That's the third harmonic. A square, you divide a circle by 4. That's the fourth harmonic. And I should stop here just for a moment, and this would be an entirely different 1 or 2 hour talk that I have given and I'm not giving now. But the fourth harmonic may be one of the most important, or maybe the most important harmonic from one point of view. And that is because the angle of dividing something in half and dividing it in half again and dividing it in half again, nature creates maximum resistance at the halfway point of any cycle, because for halfway through a cycle, it's like the energy is going out and then it comes back in. It's the ebb and the flow of a tide. And when you divide any cycle in half again, and you get to the quarter cycle. That's the fourth harmonic. That's the square. The square actually is symbolized by the cross, and the cross as the main symbol in the planet Saturn. We begin to understand how Saturn as the gateway to physical reality, that the 90-degree angle is basically built on the same resistance that Saturn is, and for that matter, the nodes. And so you can probably find this online. I've given a lecture many times on the relationship between Saturn, the nodes, and squares. Why? Because they manifest things in the three-dimensional reality. And the squares are so important that there are entire schools of astrology built around the concept of utilizing the fourth harmonic. And I'm thinking here of cosmobiology, Uranian astrology, where you magnify, you create what we call the fourth harmonic chart in order to look at squares and half squares and squares and a half and quarter squares and things that we don't normally look at. But this is all about manifestation in the three dimensions. And so the squares have a particular importance in the Ptolemaic aspects. And then we jump to the sextiles, which is the sixth harmonic. Now, the thing about conjunctions, oppositions, trines, squares, and sextiles is that each of those harmonic numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6, all divide evenly into 12. Astrology is a 12-fold system, and it is inherent in the entire creation of the symbolic system of astrology that we use is based upon division by 12. And I like to remind myself and everyone else that there are not 12 signs up there. There are not 12 signs up there. There are 12 signs in here. We've divided the universe into 12 because it's an absolutely powerfully convenient number, because we can divide it evenly by 1, 2, 3, and 4. And no other number is like that, or 12 is the lowest number, and 6 then. And so we have all of our timekeeping based upon, the 12-fold division, even 60, 12 hours in a day, 24 or 12 hours in a day and a night. 24 hours is 12 times 2, 60 minutes and 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. That's 12 times 5. The 12-foldness is incredibly important. And what we learn through astrology, what we call the Ptolemaic aspects, this comes from a portion of traditional astrology that was more interested in the signs than in the mathematical degrees of where a particular planet was. Now, both of those things are important, but in the Ptolemaic view of things, two planets were conjunct or conjoined if they were in the same sign. So if you had if you were born with the moon at 3 degrees of Aquarius, and you were born with Mars at 17 degrees of Aquarius, they were conjoined because they were in the same sign. And if that moon was in Aquarius at any degree and Mars was in Leo, the opposite sign, they were in opposition. So the fact of the matter is that aspects really came into being astrologically through our Ptolemaic understanding based upon the 12 signs. If two planets were in the same element, they were trined. If they were in the same modality, they were squared. And if they were in the same, what's the word I'm looking for here? Gender, yin yang, masculine, feminine, polarity, then they were sextile. So these were the basic Ptolemaic aspects. And in fact, if a planet was not conformed to one of these aspects, they were considered unaspected. And this is the 12th harmonic. We divide by 12 and we get the 30 and the 150 degree aspects, which really meant in Ptolemy's way of looking at things that these were inconjunct. And those people who refer to quincunxes, which is a 150 degree aspect, as inconjuncts are correct and incorrect. Because an inconjunct is a semisextile and a quincunx. It means that there's no relationship between the planets. They're kind of invisible, and yet they're still both present. So the semisextile is one kind of inconjunct, and that's a 30-degree aspect. The other Ptolemaic inconjunct is the 12th harmonic. This will have particular interest to us as we go along today. Even though it's an inconjunct, it's actually a quincunx. And although most of us say quincunx, it's actually quincunx because it's 5/12ths. And the keywords for quincunx, as most of us know, is adjustment, irritation. It's like one of these aspects that's impossible to bring into focus and impossible to make go away. And again, the quincunx is going to be particularly important to us at the end of the lecture, and so that's why it's here. We'll come back to it. Now, it's my contention that the Ptolemaic aspects and the division of the zodiac by 12 is largely about physical manifestation. That when we come to the fourth harmonic, the conjunctions, the squares, the oppositions, we can even add into that the half squares and square and a halves. But those aspects are all about physical manifestation, which is why the Germanic cosmobiology, Uranian astrology has focused on the fourth harmonic. Why, if we're looking at someone's chart, if there's a square or an opposition or a conjunction, that's where we go, because that creates the dynamic tension that something becomes manifest. On the other hand, the sixth harmonic, which includes, I should say a quick word about this, is that the fourth harmonic is not just squares, it's also squares, oppositions, and conjunctions, because it's like fractions. You go down the list. So in other words, a sixth harmonic is a division of the circle by 6, which includes sextiles and trines.
Excuse me,
someone
Rick,
has
for
their
just
microphone
1 minute.
on. Is that you,
Yes.
Carol?
No, I'm trying to mute caller 10. If you came in as caller 10, can you self-mute yourself, or I'll have to dismiss the call because you're making a lot of noise and I'm unable for some reason to mute you on this line. So caller 10, can you please mute yourself? And okay, it seems like it's quiet now. Thank you.
No problem. So the idea that aspects themselves create physical manifestation, and historically, astrologers have been about physical manifestation. In other words, if you look historically at what astrology has been used for, it's been used to either predict events, that is to say before, dictation, to speak before. It's been used for physicality, for diseases, for marriages, for divorces, for military manipulation, for knowing when to time battles or interactions. These are all about things that exist in the real world: accidents, birth, death. These are all physical events. The problem is that we now live in a world where we know that the physical side of things is only one piece of it, maybe not even the most important piece, but it certainly is significant. So here we're going to come back to the question of orbs, and I'm going to jump to a screen and see if I can make this work. All right, apparently not. Let's come back here. Bear with me here just 1 second. Maybe we can do this. Okay, so we're going to take a quick detour into orbs, and if I was with a group of people, I would want to ask, basically, with a conjunction, which is a first harmonic aspect, what's the widest orb under any circumstances anyone would use? So I would ask the entire group to say, don't say anything out loud, but I'm going to count to 3. And at my count of 3, I want everyone at the same time to say the number of degrees of orb they would allow for a conjunction in whatever circumstance they could imagine. And normally I go 1, 2, 3, and I hear in the group numbers 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 15. Different people use different orbs, but I'm going to say that most people use between 8 and 10 degrees. Now, There are people who will use very narrow orbs for whatever school of astrology they come from. Then they may use orbs as narrow as 3 or 4 degrees for a conjunction. There are other people that might go, well, if it's a sun and a moon, 15 degrees is still a conjunction. I'm not here to tell you what orbs to use. In fact, whatever orbs you use, go for it. Not a problem with me. But let's see if I can change how this erases. This is, bear with me here a second. Okay, so I'm going to say 8 to 10 degrees for most people as orbs they would use for a conjunction. Then I would ask, what about an opposition? For an opposition, most people are going to say around the same. Oftentimes I get people who say 12 degrees for a conjunction, but for an opposition, they only use 10. But I'm going to go 8 to 10 here just to give a range. If you use 6 or 7 or 12, that's okay with me. I'm looking at making a larger point here. We go to 3, the third harmonic, which is a trine. And here, normally it gets a little bit narrower. Instead of 8 to 10, it's maybe 6 to 8. But again, for those of you who use a 10-degree orb, it's fine. Whatever you use is what you use. For a square, most people, again, go back to the 8 degrees or 8 to 10 or something. And this is an interesting thing because the square seems to be more important in some cases than the trine. The trine sustains what is, the square makes something different. That which is different stands out. Typically, squares stand out more than trines, but they may or may not be more resonant. It's just that they're more observable. And then we jump to the 6th harmonic, the sextile. And for the sextile, we normally see people going down to about 3 to 5 degree orb, at least in that range. Again, your individual mileage may vary. Then when we go to the semisextile, which is a 12th harmonic, the semisextile, often people use a very tight orb, using maybe only 2 degrees as an orb. And for the other 12th harmonic aspect, the quincunx, often people use a 3 or 4 degrees orb. Now, again, this varies individually, but the point here is as you go this way, the orbs get less and less. The rule here is that the lower the harmonic, the wider the orb. The higher the harmonic, the tighter the orb. So this is an important concept to hold on to. And the reason why it's so important is that all of the aspects that we talked about so far are all based upon a 12-fold zodiac. That the conjunction, the opposition, the trine, the square, the sextile, and the semisextile, and the quincunx all divide evenly into 12. And this is hugely important because what happens is that we're skipping over 5 and we're skipping over 7. What happens is that the 5s and the 7s, because 5 doesn't divide evenly into 12, 7 doesn't divide evenly into 12, that we basically, those fall away and they become automatically less important. And so here, what we need to just realize at first is that as the harmonic goes up, the orbs go down. That we have to narrow, we have to make a smaller net so that we can actually capture the fish that we're looking for. And so we've just kind of going to go through these screens. We kind of just did this, the orbs on each of these aspects. For semi-squares and sesqui-squares, a lot of people, some beginners do not use them, but they kind of work like squares in effect, and yet the aspects typically are tighter than squares. If you're using 6 or 8 degrees or 10 degrees for a square. Most people will use somewhere around 3 degrees or something, 3 or 4 degrees for a semi-square. And I should say that a semi-square is an eighth harmonic. Why? It's half of a square. A square is 1/4. Half of a quarter is an eighth. So semi-squares, 1/8, sesqui-squares, 3/8, that these are eighth harmonic aspects. Now, the concept, though, is that as the harmonic goes up, the orb goes down. Now, the reason why this is so significant is that minor aspects are not minor. The fact of the matter is that a quintile, which is based upon a fifth harmonic, a quintile, if we can get back to this screen just for a quick second here. A quintile, which is based upon, come on. There we go. So a quintile, which is based upon 1/5 of a circle, is basically, it falls through the 12-foldness. 1/5 of a circle equals 72 degrees. In fact, the quintile is based upon the 5-pointed star. And this becomes very, very significant. But most people, even those people who use quintiles, call them minor aspects. And therefore, often, I can't tell you how many astrologers I've talked to or talked with over the years who go, oh, sure, I use quintiles. What kind of orb do you give them? Oh, I give them a 3-degree orb, or I give them a 2-degree orb. Why? Because they're a minor aspect. So here's the deal. If a quintile is 1/5 of a circle, 1/5 of a circle, which is a quintile, a square is 1/4 of a circle, a sextile is 1/6 of a circle. And let's put the septile in here, even though we're not really kind of talking about them yet. The septile. So here's the deal. The question is, what orb do you use for squares? And if most people use 8 to 10 degrees, let's just say 8. Again, if you use 12, that's fine with me. But let's say you use 8 degrees for a square, and let's say you use 3 degrees for a sextile. Understanding the fact that aspects are vibrations, that they're harmonies, and that the lower the harmonic, the louder the hum. The base frequency is the fundamental frequency, and all the others become harmonic frequencies. That understanding aspects that way would lead one to the conclusion that the orb that one would use for a quintile would need to be higher than a sextile and lower than a square. Why? Because the fifth harmonic is in between the fourth and the sixth harmonic. And so what I'm going to throw out there just for right now is a 5-degree orb. But if you're arbitrarily using 3 or 2 degrees orb for a quintile, you're basically falling into the trap of believing that physical things are more important than non-physical things. And this is something that hopefully we as a culture, as a species, are separating ourselves from. But the fact of the matter is that if you're using 2 or 3 degree orbs on a quintile, you'll never see enough of them to know what they really do. That the orb that you use for a quintile needs to be somewhere in between what you use for a sextile and a square. 5 degrees, even 6 degrees is not too wide. And for the septile, I typically use 2.5 degrees. This probably would make some people crazy, but it's all done by computer. I would rather use 3 degrees than 2 degrees on the septile, because otherwise you miss things that are incredibly important. And as we get closer to the end of the lecture, we'll look at charts and I'll make a strong case for these. But I wanted to, before we started doing that, I wanted you to understand why the orbs have to be wider than we typically use, or we will never see the aspects that we're really looking to find. So let's come back to Okay, we seem to have lost this. We'll come back to this. Oh, there we are. All right, so so here we have the idea of physical aspects versus metaphysical aspects, and it's my contention that the fifth and seventh harmonic aspects are both metaphysical, which means that even though I use them regularly, you'll never predict an event occurring based upon strictly a fifth or seventh harmonic, a quintile or septile series. And when I use the word quintile, I really actually mean quintile series, because a quintile is 72 degrees. We go back to that 5-pointed star. Its two adjacent points on the 5-pointed star are 72 degrees. And if we look at two non-adjacent points on that 5-pointed star, then we're looking at 144 degrees. And the same is true with the seventh harmonic. Let's go back here for a quick second. So that with a 5-pointed star, which is the fifth harmonic, we have 72 degrees. So two planets that are 72 degrees apart is a quintile. But if we have two planets that are 144 degrees apart, that's 72 and 72, that is a biquintile. So quintiles include quintiles and biquintiles. By the same token, we have the septile. Whoops, went back one too many. We have the septile. That's a 7-pointed star, and we have two adjacent points that are two planets that are that are in the same, that are in points of the star next to each other. That's the 7 is a weird thing, because 7 goes into 360 degrees, not only unequally, it doesn't fit to the zodiac, but it's also non-decimal. It's actually 51.428. It's one of these numbers that goes on and on and on. So it's really like 51 degrees and 26 minutes is a septile. 51 degrees 26 minutes. That's two planets that are adjacent. Now, if we take a look at two planets that are not quite adjacent, but are one apart, this is a biseptile, and a biseptile is the 51 times 2, which is 102 degrees, and it turns out to be 0.857, which is actually 102 degrees and like 51 minutes, close enough. And then if we look at the 3, we can just go here to, that would be the triseptile, and that would be 154 degrees. That's actually 0.286, I think. Yep. And that would be 154 degrees and 17 minutes. So you can see here that without a computer, no one would ever look at this shit. That's basically an important concept. And the fact of the matter is that it took a genius like Johannes Kepler to come up with the idea of quintiles, a mathematical genius, and he got resistance from it from his contemporaries, who basically said, "How, you can't just make up aspects." And Kepler's thing was, well, aspects are not just sign-based, they're also mathematical. And so he was the guy who really introduced us into this new way of looking at aspects and introduced the quintiles. But it's interesting because even Kepler, who used the quintiles and biquintiles, basically said, but septiles, he didn't call them that. He goes, division by 7 doesn't work because it's too complicated. God doesn't use sevens. Now that's very different than Isaac Newton, who is a total 7 freak. You know, we have 7 days of the week, of course, but we have 7 colors in the visible rainbow because Isaac Newton added indigo because he wanted 7, because he was a 7 freak. All right, so let's come back to the astrology piece of this here, and okay, so let's talk just a moment about the fifth harmonic and what do we do with it. The fifth harmonic is based upon, first of all, it is non-physical, and it's 72 degrees and 144 degrees. And this is the basis of the pentagram. In fact, it's the idea of the five-pointed star as being a symbol to the access of non-physical realities. If you think of the use of the pentagram in various metaphysical, feminine-based earth religions, the pentagram or the pentagon gets us outside of the fourfold division of the universe. The fourfold division is physical. That's Saturn. That's the real world as we see it. When we go to the five-pointed star, all of a sudden, we don't see it. It's invisible. It's not there unless we learn about it, and then we can understand it, but it's not perceivable through our five senses. By the way, there is also a semi-quintile and sesquiquintile, and these are the half quintiles. Hold on one second. The half quintiles of 36 degrees, and the quintile and a half of 108 degrees. And these are also very usable. I'm not going there today, but just understand that they certainly are there. And from a standpoint of using harmonics, we would also look at not only the fifth harmonic, but the 10th in that series. And we could continue down that series even. So the Renaissance philosophers had this basic question, and the question was, is there something that's out there that's inherently beautiful, or is beauty always a function of our own values that are overlaid onto reality? What is beauty? Is it something that is natural with or without our value judgment? Now, of course, here we're thinking of Venus as the planet that would come out in this question based upon value and beauty. So the conclusion of the Renaissance astrologers, philosophers, and I'm thinking here of Da Vinci and even the Da Vinci Code, is that beauty exists independent of consciousness, that there is in fact something that we call beauty that does exist, and it turns out that this concept of beauty is tied into the five-fold division. The rose itself as a five-petaled as a five-petaled plant, is a good example of the relationship between the five-foldness of quintiles and the five-foldness of beauty itself. And here, and this could also be a full hour lecture. Jeff writes, oh, I missed your comment, Jeff. Somehow it went away. How do I get that back? I'll come back to it. Oh, I think I can go right here.
I can.
Regarding the fifth harmonic aspect, they add up to 9. Yes and no. I don't have anything specific to say about it now, but it's an interesting thing that we could talk about for sure. All right, how do I get rid of this? Okay, so the talk about the golden mean or the divine proportion actually could be an entire an entire lecture, but here I just want to say that this magical number has been something that has intrigued philosophers and astrologers for millennia, and it's very important because on this particular fivefoldness, that's the five-pointed star, it turns out that the five-pointed star is the only way in which we can create okay, we're just there we go. The five-pointed star is the only way in which the Greeks or anyone could create the golden mean. And it turns out, and I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, I just want to mention that in a five-pointed star, if you look at where the lines of the star intersect each other, they actually intersect each other so that every diagonal, every line on this becomes divided into a shorter and a longer length, and that the shorter length, if you said the shorter length was 1 unit long, the longer length would be 1.6180333 ... So the ratio of the golden mean, and in fact, if you said the longer length was 1 unit long, then the entire diagonal itself would be 1.618, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. My point being here that the golden mean, this 1.6180339, this number that goes on forever, is found inside of the five-pointed star. And here the other piece of this puzzle is the fact that that Venus going around the sun with Earth out here, Venus, as you know, makes 5 synodic conjunctions with the Earth every 8 years. 5 times 8 years. The Fibonacci number series, 1 plus 1 equals 2, 2 plus 1 equals 3, 3 plus 2 equals 5, 5 plus 3 equals 8, etc. And that this 5/8 of Venus to the sun, that it turns out that Venus, which takes 224 and a half days to go around the sun once, the Earth takes 365 and a quarter days to go around once. That when you divide the cycle of Earth by the cycle of Venus, you come up to 1.62, the golden mean. So Venus is actually the real physical incarnation of what this quintile means. It is the division by 5. It is beauty. It is love. It is the soul that is not physical. And this is why using the quintiles are so important, because it shows us something about the non-physical dimensions of the soul. Dane Rudhyar called the quintiles the aspect of talent. Why? It's about the soul's capability that may or may not be manifest, but when we find what that talent is and we manifest it, we're actually touching on the quintiles within our charts. So here I already mentioned the Fibonacci numbers. If this resonates with you, fine. I want to get onto some astrology, but the connection here between the Da Vinci Code, Da Vinci's quest for beauty, his understanding of what we call the divine proportion, or sometimes called the divine proportion or the golden mean. These were concepts that drove not only Da Vinci, but even Kepler was fascinated with this mathematical ratio, and Kepler was the guy who introduced quintiles. And so we have the number 5 as being magical but non-astrological. What happened? I get interference. Oh, it's gone. Okay. That some quintile keywords. Can you hear me?
I'm going to see
something
who's
happened.
On. Yes, we can hear you. I'm just seeing where the culprit is. I'm not seeing that. If you are caller 10, I believe it is. Yes, caller 10. Could you please unmute? Could you please mute yourself, self-mute you, because for some reason I'm unable to mute you? Okay, Rick, I think that stopped.
Okay, so now we're getting to, and I'm sorry for the long preamble, but if we just talked about what the meaning of quintiles are, we would never understand why they're so important. So when one is interpreting quintiles, quintiles are spiritual. They're creative. They're magical. They're not physical. They're metaphysical. However, when I see a strong quintile aspect or quintile picture in someone's chart, a configuration even, and one or more of those planets is tied up in an opposition or in a square, then that becomes a point of manifestation. So quintiles are metaphysical, they're natural, they're artistic. They have aesthetic value to them, just like Venus, they're beautiful. And in fact, they're humorous. Oddly enough, I mean, quintiles can be very clever. I've seen strong quintile charts in many, many comedians, charts that stand out in my mind with strong quintiles. I say strong quintiles, I mean either multiple quintiles or patterns that form on a 5-pointed star with 2 or 3 or 4 or even 5 points of that 5-pointed star. And I'm thinking of charts like John Cleese, Robin Williams, Groucho Marx, Harpo Marx, Charlie Chaplin. These are a few that come to mind that were comedians that had incredibly strong quintile charts. The other side of it is you take that 5-pointed star and you turn it upside down, it becomes a symbol for Satanism. And quintiles can be domineering. They can be painful, cruel, black magic, even violent. And a couple of strong quintile charts to show that side of it. You know, again, astrology doesn't judge the good or the bad. It judges basically what the energy is, and what we do about it is, and how we work with it can be very different. But very strong quintile charts. Sorry for that phone ringing in the background. It'll go away in a second. So I thought I'd turn my ringer off. So strong quintile charts in people like Adolf Hitler, Albert Speer, Marquis de Sade. It doesn't mean that if you have a strong quintile in your chart, you will be this horrible, mean, pain-inducing person. But there certainly is that propensity, just like there's a propensity towards spiritual creativity, you also do see this other side of quintiles. And I just wanted to mention that in passing. Now we jump to the seventh harmonic, and the seventh harmonic, again, is a bit more complicated because it doesn't come out evenly. Now, I just want to say as a quick aside, I've trained myself to look at charts and to see quintiles pretty quickly. Septiles, biseptiles, and triseptiles are a bit tougher, but you can train yourself to look at them. The fact of the matter is that all of the decent astrology programs out there will allow you to turn aspects on or off or create aspects. And I suggest that one creates an aspect series to look at the fifth and seventh harmonics. In fact, I have my computer set up so that I can look at them even separately. So I look at a chart and I can see all of the regular aspects, and then I look at that same chart with all the regular aspect lines taken out and only the quintiles and septiles. It helps me understand. It's like looking at things through a different power of a microscope, and we'll get there in just a moment. Well, I mean, we'll look at a couple of charts that way. I know we're pushing on time already. Okay, so the seventh harmonic, the fifth harmonic is non-physical, but it manifests physically through plants, through flowers, five-fold flowers. We got that interference again from someone. Okay. So that the five-fold. Hello.
Can hear you, okay. Rick. I'm working on. I'm going to have to dismiss caller 10. You may have to call back caller 10.
Okay.
I'm going to see if that helps, Rick.
Okay, thank you. The five-foldness, the quintile series, is like five-fold flowers. They're beautiful. Many, many, many flowers have five-fold symmetry, and of course, the rose is one of those that stands out as a symbol of love, as a symbol of what the meaning of quintiles and Venus actually is. With the seventh harmonic, it's a bit tougher to manifest in the three-dimensional world. And this then becomes the key to our interpretation. Dane Rudhyar called the seventh harmonic, or the septile aspect series, the septile, biseptile, and triseptile, he called them the aspect of fate. I agree with that, but I think that Dane Rudhyar was looking at the cause, not the symptom. In other words, the seventh harmonic can certainly be a high level of fate, but I think it's because there's stuff going on other planes, other dimensions, other worlds, parallel universes that come crashing through. And that crashing through of the septile is what Nick Pollerstrom, in his book called The Eureka Effect, which he talks about quintiles and septiles and their relationship to scientific breakthrough, that this aha, it's the seventh harmonic is more Uranian than anything else. And I don't think it's with the fifth harmonic, with the quintile, the relationship between quintiles and Venus is very, very strong. The seventh harmonic in Uranus is not quite as exacting or strong, but there's this idea that the seventh harmonic is otherworldly and it comes crashing through like the lightning striking. So we look at some example septile charts, and we see charts of people who don't fit in real easily. Washington Irving, the guy who wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. This is very septilian. It's otherworldly. Princess Diana, we have that interference coming in again on the, okay.
Yes.
Princess Di, also strong septile chart. I mean, here's a woman who was a real princess, and yet she probably felt more at home on the streets of Calcutta with or Kolkata with Mother Teresa than she did in Buckingham Palace. There was another worldly aspect of her being. We look at people like Michael Jackson. In a few minutes, we'll look at David Bowie's chart. These are Edgar Allan Poe, Emily Dickinson, a strong septile chart. I mean, these are people who were not connected with their three-dimensional being. They had stuff going on from other times, other places. When I see a chart that has very strong septiles in it, I know that the person whose chart that is has a strong relationship with non-physical entities, with ghosts, goblins, aliens, ancestors, guides, spirit guides, things that go bump in the night. And these are people who have very, very powerful relationships with the other side. So just tying back to the quincunx before we look at a couple of charts, is that we said earlier the quincunx, which is a 12th harmonic aspect, the key word is adjustment. And now you're going to learn why. The reason why the quincunx is so unstable is that of all the points in the zodiac, it is inherently the most unstable point in the zodiac. Why? Because the 5th harmonic, which is louder than the 12th harmonic, is at 144 degrees. That's the biquintile, 2/5 of a circle. The 7th harmonic, which is at 154 degrees, 0.28, or 154 degrees, 17 minutes, that's at 100. That's the triseptile. And halfway between the biquintile and the triseptile is the 149 degree point. And I remember having conversations with the legendary Marion March, who was a quincunx aficionado. She used them a lot. And she agreed that the 149 degree quincunx seemed to be stronger than the 151 degree quincunx, whether it was applying or separating. Now, what's interesting with that, to me, what's interesting about that is that quincunx is actually such an unstable point, it wants to jump to the quintiles series or the septile series, and so it can't hold its point. It's like it's unstable. And so when I look at charts that have a lot of quincunxes, I will often look at which direction does that quincunx go. Does it go to the biquintile or the 5th harmonic or the 7th harmonic? All right, so the importance of the metaphysical aspects is this. Caroline Casey says, imagination lays the tracks for the reality train to follow. William Blake said, what is now proved was once only imagined. So now here we go with a couple of quick charts. These are going to be pretty quick looks at them, but it'll give you an idea of what we're talking about. Here we have a chart of William Blake. In this chart, you can see that there's this sun in Sagittarius, conjunct Jupiter, even widely conjunct Mercury, left over in Scorpio. There's a focus here on the Mars and Neptune. There's a Cancer moon. Fine, we could look at all this. We could dig into this. We could see William Blake in this chart unquestionably. We can see this yod, this quincunx between Chiron and Venus to Mars and Neptune and back to Uranus. All this stuff is there, and I'm not suggesting that we should leave this stuff aside, but I am suggesting that when we look at the same chart, the yellow lines here are quintiles, and the purple lines are septiles. That's the color system that I've used for years. And what you see here in William Blake's chart is a whole new level of symmetry, where you can see the sun and Saturn and the moon on 3 points of a 5-pointed star. I call this a golden yod. Golden yod, it's a quintile yod, but it's based on the golden mean, the 5th harmonic. And my experience is that when I see a golden yod in a chart where there are 3 planets, 72 degrees apart, and each of them 144 degrees. It's like a regular yod where the base has been widened from 60 degrees to 72 degrees. This becomes an absolute critical. It's as strong as a grand trine, or as a T-square, or as a grand square. This is an absolutely profoundly powerful configuration, and when you see one in a chart, you have something to say about it. I do, certainly. Incidentally, I find it fascinating that Jim Morrison, who named his band The Doors, after William Blake's Marriage of Heaven and Hell, if the doors of perception were cleansed, then everything would appear as it is, infinite and holy, blah, 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 blah. And that Jim Morrison had a great affinity to William Blake, even naming his band after a William Blake work. And that Jim Morrison had a quintile or golden yod with the moon at the apex, just like William Blake, and the sun at one point, but where Blake has Saturn, he was an engraver. Jim Morrison had Neptune. He was a space cadet and a poet. Not that they both weren't, but they both have this resonance. It's a very interesting story, and just wanted to mention it in passing. A quick look at David Bowie's chart. Again, those of us who know his chart know that he is such a Mars-Sun conjunction, that energy that goes out, the oddity of that connected to the quincunx, to Uranus, the Saturn Pluto Moon stellium in Leo, and the Moon Saturn Moon trine Venus. I mean, this is all David Bowie. But the thing is that unless you look at the septiles, you miss something incredible, and that is that the Saturn Moon conjunction, actually the Saturn Moon Pluto, are all triseptile to the Mercury, Mars, and Sun, and then there's another very close septile between Venus and Neptune, and that Venus-Neptune quintile, if you can see down here on the aspect grid, is 0 degrees 4 minutes of orb is how close this septile is. And if that doesn't talk about the otherworldliness of his aesthetic and his understanding of Venus and beauty, and then we look at this triseptile between these Capricorn planets and the Leo planets, and we begin to understand the otherworldliness, the alienness, that David Bowie actually really was an alien. And that when you see charts with such strong septile resonance, these people come through as not convinced that this plane, that this Earth plane is the most important one. We look at Princess Di's chart, and again, I'm just going to move through these very quickly. This PowerPoint can be made available to OPA for. Oh, we actually have the I guess the whole thing with this on the video recording.
Yes, you'll all receive it later on today. You'll receive the whole presentation.
Fine. Okay. So Princess Di, Sagittarius rising, Sun in Cancer. We can look at this incredibly strong T-square with the need for eccentricity and the sudden changes in her life, with the Uranus opposed Moon square Venus. All of this is real. But when we go to the septile version of this, we see, to me, one of the singular most convincing septile charts I've ever seen, because it has, in effect, a septile yod, meaning that the 60-degree angle of the base has been narrowed to 51 degrees, which has made then the two sides that would normally be a quincunx, it has turned those into triseptiles at 154 degrees. And so what we end up here with is two interlaced septile yods. Mercury, septile Uranus, both it's Mercury, septile Mars, both triseptile to, let me do this again. It's this side of it. It's Mercury, septile Uranus, both triseptile to Saturn, and then we have Jupiter at the point of the yod that involves the Sun and Mars. And again, you can see, looking at this aspect grid, how close, and the Jupiter, I mean, we're looking at less than a degree for the Mars Sun to the Jupiter Sun. We're looking at very 11 minutes of orb between the Uranus and Saturn. This was an incredibly powerful draw to the spiritual, the fated. Again, you look at Dane Rudhyar's word fate, and you see how she moved through life. And it was almost like on the other side, people were moving around pieces on a chessboard. She walked into a room and someone moved a piece, and boom, all of a sudden she was a princess. Boom, all of a sudden, it's that suddenness of change. Michael Jackson, another very strong septile chart. Incidentally, we do not have an accurate date, birth time of Michael Jackson. It's what, and Lois Rodden, it's DD, it's dirty data. We know a day he was born, but we do not know an ascendant, and we do not know the moon. However, even without knowing that, and we can see here, his Pluto Sun, conjunction, sure, that makes sense. A Pisces moon, sure, that makes sense. This stellium in Leo, again, sure, that makes sense. But when we go to the septile version of this, we see that even without the moon, which may actually be a fifth point on the seven-pointed star, but he has Mars biseptile to the Pluto Sun, which are septile to the Jupiter Neptune, which are septile to the Saturn, which is in turn triseptile back to the Mars. In effect, Michael Jackson has 1, 2, 3, 4 points on a seven-pointed star. Again, this is a hugely profound configuration, and it speaks to the fact that he lived in, he lived in a fantasy realm. And fantasy here does not mean that it's not real. It just means that it's not of the three dimensions. And Michael Jackson certainly moved through life with a, I want to say casual, but with a, I'm going to use the word, with a casual relationship to the physical world. There was much more going on for him in the realm of fantasy, spirituality. The metaphysical was more important than the physical. Richard Nixon, another strong septile chart. I want to just jump here to Edgar Allan Poe, another strong septile chart. Emily Dickinson, this chart is fascinating because of the symmetry of the Saturn to the moon, and we do have good birth time on her, to the Sagittarius. Here's a woman who wrote about the world. Her vision of the world was wide and deep, and yet she never left her home. She never left her town. And so this was a chart that was all otherworldly, internal, imaginative. And with Saturn, the moon, the Sagittarian stellium, and then the Mars, Pluto, again, 1, 2, 3, 4 points. Oh, and even Uranus is in there. 5 points on a seven-pointed star makes a very convincing and strong argument for Emily Dickinson being what I like to call her as a septillion. Washington Irving, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, again a strong septile chart, and you can see we have good accurate time on him also, but you can see that his Mercury to Saturn is within 1 minute of orb. And so he wrote about Saturn, things that are real, Mercury, with a sense of intuitiveness that brought us into realms that were non-physical. Whether we're looking at Rip Van Winkle or The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, this is someone who was tapped into other dimensions. And now the last chart I want to look at is the chart for the bombing of the first bombing of the World Trade Tower at 8:43 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, New York City, September 11th, 2001. And this chart is a chart that's been looked at by many, 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 many people. Of course, we have the Saturn-Pluto opposition, which incidentally, that Saturn-Pluto dance will be the subject of one of my UAC talks. We're coming into this, as many of us know, in January of 2020, the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. But this certainly, the Saturn-Pluto opposition with Saturn trining Mercury, Mercury rising, this chart is a good reminder that trines are neither good nor bad. They simply express what is. And Saturn certainly came through the expression here. Saturn, being in the sign of the twins, the twin towers, all this imagery is valid. But when you look at the septiles on this, you go, oh my God. This is actually a moment in time where something came crashing through with the other side. It wasn't from the other side. It was not just a single event. We have incredibly strong, again, I have my solar fire set up so that the closer the aspect, the fatter the lines. And although I don't have the orbs here on the chart, the Uranus to the Sun to the Mars, and that Mars is conjunct the South Node. These are 3 points on a 7-pointed star. And then we look at the Neptune to Jupiter and the Moon as the fastest moving planet timed to Venus. This chart is a septilian chart. It was fated. It was a moment where something came crashing through that had way more importance in that moment than it could have had at any other moment in time. So in summary, when we look at the quintiles and septiles, we need to understand the difference between physical and metaphysical, and the fact that metaphysical is not less important than the physical. In fact, it may be more important. Why? Because that which is manifest physically is first metaphysical. That meta becomes physical, and that when we look at quintiles and septiles, we can begin to see what's behind the physical manifestation. That when we use quintiles and septiles, we're basically adding another dimension to our readings. I recall, Carl Jung's autobiography, Memory, Dreams, and Reflections. He basically said in the preface of that book, he was, I'm not going to tell you about anything that happened in my life on the outside, because that wouldn't be a real autobiography. I'm going to talk to you about what's important, about what my memories are, what my dreams were, and I'm going to talk to you about my inside stuff. And here we have the difference between the astrology of the 90-degree angle and the astrology of the 72 or 51-degree angle. And that is that when we begin to look at these metaphysical aspects, we begin to see, like Jung's autobiography, we begin to see the meaning of things that are behind the manifestation of the physical things that we would normally be trained to look at. We can look at the higher resonance of charts by looking at the hum and integrating the various resonance systems. The thing is that we have to use orbs that are wide enough. Forget about this quintiles and septiles being minor aspects. That is a patriarchal leftover bullshit thing of a Saturn world where what you see is what you get, and if you can't perceive it in the outer world, then it doesn't exist. It's a red herring. It's not true, and we have a huge bias towards things that are manifest. I remember Ram Dass once saying, I attended a workshop of his or several of his years ago, and he said, so how many people here in this room feel like they're, like they don't have any biases, and there was a new age crowd and a bunch of people raised their hand. He goes, so what would you say if I told you that one of my best friends doesn't have a body? And he went on to talk about this spirit that he had a long time relationship through a channel friend of his, and as this was a person who was in his life, and so we put a strong emphasis on things that are not physical are not real. That's not true. Things that are not physical, but illusions, fantasies, dreams, reflections, imagination is real, and it's what creates the physical afterwards. So use wide enough orbs, and most importantly, don't be afraid of the unknown. So therein ends my presentation part of this, and I'm happy to take a few questions. I know we went over a little bit in time. I hope that's okay, Carol. I hope I didn't
it's
overstay
absolutely
my welcome.
fine, Rick. We do have a couple of questions, and thank you for sticking around with us and giving us all this. There's so much to this, so we really appreciate your time that you've been taking with us. Kim has a question, and she says, do you include aspects to the ascendant and nodes, or just planets for these?
Hi, Kim. That's a really good question, and I have to admit, I struggle with some of these questions. I sometimes come across as someone who I have a lot of planets in Aries, and I come across like what I say is this is the way it is. I don't know. I do look at quintile. I assume ascendant, midheaven, nodes, even dark moon Lilith. These are points that are real points. There's something there, whether or not we can see them. And from that standpoint, yes, I do look at quintiles to those points. The trick, though, is And over the years, I've spent a lot of time looking at transiting quintiles and septiles, and I kind of, in my client work, have let some of that go away unless there's something very profound, because it's hard to talk about the connection between a metaphysical aspect and a metaphysical point. And so it's a tricky thing. I think they are important. A lot more work is needed there just beyond my individual client work. And as more people are using this, I'm seeing this more and more in the literature. The bottom answer is that when I look at client charts, I do look at aspects to the ascendant, midheaven, and nodal axis with the same level of import as I do planets to planets. And I'd rather see the aspect and then make less of it rather than never see it at all. I hope that answered your question, Kim.
Thank you. And then Louise and Ellen and Chrissy are all saying what a fabulous presentation. We're getting lots of really great input from your presentation, Rick. Teresa does have a question, and she is asking if Jung had any of this ongoing in his chart.
Yes, he did. Actually, Jung, Freud, Hermann Hesse, they all had strong quintiles. Not so much septiles that I remember. I don't have the charts in front of me. I probably could go dig for it right now, but I'm not going to. The thing is that whichever program you use on a regular basis, you can set up the aspects so that you have the ability to look at these. You can set up an aspect table that shows just wide sloppy orbs for quintiles and septiles, and you can go back and look at all the charts that you've looked at that and just cycle through them to see which ones have strong quintiles and septiles that you may not have noticed. I will often give a hard copy of a chart. I would say that probably upwards to a third of my regular clients are longtime practicing professional astrologers. It's one of my favorite things is to sit with someone who's been an astrologer for 10 or 30 years and talk about aspects of their chart that they never noticed or never saw, including the quintiles and septiles. And often I will give a client a printout of a chart that only has the septiles noted in it, so that they can reframe how they look at their chart and make connections between planets that they never made connections between before.
Great. And Rick, I don't know if you'll be able to answer this, but Courtney has a question. She says, thank you. And can you please show us how to set our septiles and quintiles with the 5.25 degree orbs and make them purple and yellow in solar fire?
The answer is yes and no. Mm-hmm. I know that many people here use solar fire, but just as a matter of course, it's really important to state that just because I'm using it, I like some of the presentation aspects of it. It's by no means it's by no means the only, or it's not even necessarily the most technically proficient, whether you're using certainly Kepler software comes to mind, or one of many other programs, whether it's IO Janus or Janus or time passages or whatever. Calculations are calculations. What I've done in Solar Fire is you can actually set up a file that has an actual, those aspects. I'll tell you what I could do is I could make my my quintile and septile file, so that when you go to Solar Fire, again, I don't really want to get hung up here. You can go to aspect. Can you see my screen? You go to aspect.
Yes.
Aspect set. If you go on any chart, you right click and you go to aspect set. You click on planets, and here are the various aspect sets that I work with. And I have one that's particularly set up for septiles. I can click on that, and then I have this so that it's set up so that aspect points, display options, aspect lines are now off, and now they're on. So here's a chart for today now showing where the septiles are. The point is that you can create one of these aspect set planets, you can set that or create that, but I actually have a file that has that in it, and I could make that available. Actually, rather than making it publicly available, if you happen to be using Solar Fire, and you want my set of aspects that I use, both A, for my client work, and B, for particularly my quintile and septile research, I'd be glad to share those with you. Send me an email, and that email is to rlevine, R-L-E-V-I-N-E, rlevine at stariq.com. That is that is RLEVINE at STARIQ. This is that planahead.com.
It's absolutely perfect.
All right.
I'm sure everyone on the call is appreciating this.
rlevine at stariq.com, and I'd be glad to share that with you. There was one other thing I was going to say about aspect grids. Yeah, I look at them as different powers of the microscope. And here's something that actually is kind of important to understand. If didn't really cover this, but back to if I'm using a biquintile, which is 2/5 at 144 degrees, if I'm using a quincunx at 150, and I'm using a triseptile at 154. If I'm using a 3-degree orb here and let's say I'm using a 4-degree, I would actually use a 5 typically, but I'm using a 4-degree orb here and let's say a 3-degree orb here, just as examples. What happens is that the quincunx, which theoretically is 147 to 153, now steps over my triseptile, which would go down to 151, and my biquintile, which would go up to 148. So there's a problem here, and that problem is part of the magic of why quincunxes are so goddamn unstable. They're irritating because we can't see them, and yet we can't make them go away because they're right at that blind spot between the 5 and the 7. My point being here is that when you set up your aspect tables, you have to be aware that 150-degree quincunx point, that can be, most quincunxes will resolve either to biquintiles or triseptiles, but I'd be glad to make those files available with a short instruction list of how to set it up. But it's not the place here to go into.
Yes,
I mean, this is one program, and although it works, so do other programs, and they work just as well, but they work differently. So yeah.
Absolutely. Well, Rick, we've had just amazing comments, and I'm not going to read them all off to you because that would take another hour in itself, but just some fantastic comments from the attendees of the lecture. And again, thank you so much. Is there anything else you want to close with?
I'm just scrolling quickly through some of the Is there a way to save those comments?
Yes. Yes. I'll be happy to do that because
that would be great.
Yes, I would be happy to get
a couple of quick things. Carolyn asked if Astrodine shows septiles. I do not believe they do. And again, most astrologers, they dismiss them as minor. But it's something that we could probably talk to Eloise about, and maybe that's something that they would do at some time. Anything else standing out here?
There is one from Jacqueline.
Hi, Jacqueline.
And she is saying, let's see if I can read that real quickly. Thank you.
No, Rick. I couldn't. I didn't hear that. It got trashed by whatever that interference.
Let me see if I can mute whoever is coming in, or I'm trying to find out who that is.
Oh, I see your question. Her question is, what are the consequences of a quintile yod not being aspected by a square or opposition? And I would say that question also works for septiles, and that is often people are much more extraordinary than we realize. In other words, it's very possible to be absolutely amazingly plugged in and magical and not necessarily plug that into the external world. That doesn't, it's not a judgment as to whether or not you're a competent human being or a good person or not. It's just that sometimes the internal world or the experiences do not manifest as easily as for other people. And so I think that we can work with it. We can work with it via transits, because if we're aware of a quintile yod or quintiled planets, we can be aware when planets are making squares or oppositions to those points and try to use those points to teach ourselves or to train ourselves how to manifest. We can also, in relationship charts, oh my God, there's another whole can of worms, because quintiles and septiles in relationship charts in synastry is incredibly convincing. But by being in a relationship with someone who either has lots of squares or has planets that are 90 degrees to your quintiled planets, helps one manifest them. It's like practice. Just because you don't have something in your chart doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means you have to bring that practice into your yoga, into your daily routines until it becomes a part of you. The planets, the chart is a starting point. It's the radio station that we hear if we don't do anything about it. But we can learn to fine tune that radio. And I think that someone with a quintile yod or with any aspect that one likes or doesn't like, one can work with it, through consciousness.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Rick.
And Rick, I do have one other question from Jeff. Are the aspects set in solar fire, harm 01, 02, 04, etc., related to what you're talking about?
You mean in my table that we're looking at here? No. Wait a minute. Those might be ones that came with solar fire. I'm not exactly sure. Let me just take a quick look at that. Actually, the answer is, Jeff, I don't know. And Jack, yeah, they come with it. So yes, but it's interesting here that it looks like there's no 5, unless I've eliminated mine because I rewrote it. I don't know. But the answer is yes. And the thing, though, is that those aspects, let me just take a quick look here, are probably a lot tighter. Yeah, I've probably loosened those up. On my 7th, I've turned them into 3-degree orbs. I don't know what they come with. My guess is that the harmonic 07 is probably comes out of the wrapper. Yeah, there's no 3, 5, or 7, Jeff says. So, yeah, that's something to think about or talk about. And yeah, you can mess with those. I've created, as you look at my list here, I've created a bunch of sequences in my aspect set that I use both for research and for presentation, or for my daily column writing, or for my clients. And here I'm working on my laptop, which does not have my complete set that my desktop does. So I hope that answered the question. And I look forward to seeing many of you at UAC. And if I do see you at UAC, please come up and say hi and let me know that you were here from this. I know a lot of you who are here, but you're just funny screen names, and some of you have real names. So I can see Jacqueline, I can see Jeff, I can see other people that I know, but I know that there are people who I don't. So yes, thank you all for your indulgence.
And thank you. And we have David Cochran, so lots of people that will be at the UAC, I would imagine, as well. So we'll definitely swing by and say hello.
And as long as David is here, I had no idea you were here, David. Hi. Yeah, I mean, David is my soul brother in arms when it comes to harmonics, and Kepler software has really excelled at that and its analysis of that. And my hat's off to you and to your work. David's stuff on YouTube is absolutely important. I mean, he has devoted so much time in teaching about what he knows about this stuff. And I find it interesting that David and I hope I'm not giving away too much here, but David and I are somewhat astro twin brothers, but different because we were born about a month apart. I have a pile of planets, stellium in Aries, Aries, 1949 Aries. And by the time that that David got around to manifesting on Earth, those Aries planets had become Taurian. And so David takes a lot of the stuff that I like to think about and turn it into real stuff. And my hat's off to you for that, David. I really
Yes.
appreciate your work.
And David will be at iAstrologer as well. So just a shout out to David to thank him also for his contribution to OPA. And just one final reminder, iAstrologer, part 1 is going to be October 4th through 7th. And in beautiful Tucson, and that is going to be how to elevate your astrology practice. And then part 2 is the peer group work, consulting skills, or the astronomy for astrologers. So we hope to see you all in Tucson. And again, please look for your recording link today. We're going to be closing. Thank you all so much. And Rick, thank you so much for this amazing presentation. And all of you will be able to access this full recording link later on today. So be sure you save it into a file so you can reference it back, because I know there's so much, a wealth of information that you'll want to continue to review as you go along. Thank you again, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you all.